Smoke and mirrors, special effects, a little fear, a little sex, the lyrics to an old Magnetic Field song, and a good way to introduce today's episode of Videohead. This week, I talked to Jodi Wille, director of the critically acclaimed documentary The Source Family, about a cult of musicians in California in the 1970s, and I talked to Josh Madden, who along with his brothers Benji and Joel built Good Charlotte into one of the biggest bands around, about the role music videos played in the band's image, perception, and success. We're all about Svengalis this week. This is Videohead. The Source Family is a documentary about Father Yod, the leader of a spiritual community of artists, rich kids, and musicians in the 1970s in California. It was directed by Maria Demopoulos and my guest, Jodi Wille. Jodi also published The Source, the book on Father Yod and the Source Family. She also directed a short film called We Are Not Alone about the Unarius Academy, another California-based cult. But Jodi's first paid job was directing a music video for REM, which led her to a career as a prominent video director and band photographer in the 1990s. Jodi and I talk about the similarities between bands and cults and the iconography and image creation that goes into creating both. Here's my chat with director and documentarian Jodi Wille. Jodi Wille, thank you so much for joining me on Videohead. I appreciate you being here. This is a show about music videos, and there's so many things I want to talk to you about, but you do have a very prominent music video credit in your history. Is that correct? You directed a video for Find the River by REM, maybe my favorite REM song of all time.
Oh, nice. Yes, I did. It was my first paid job.
How do you get that as like a first paid job?
Well, that was kind of unusual. I had known the guys in REM since I was in college. I was visiting and documenting a lot of self-taught artists down in the South when I was in school in Ohio with a boyfriend of mine who had spent a lot of time at Howard Finster's down in Georgia and had gotten to know Michael Stipe a little bit and Jefferson Holt, who'd managed REM. What happened was after college, I moved out to Los Angeles and I started working on music videos as an assistant for the music video director, Sam Bayer. And I had just started to direct a video for a friend's band, the band Wille, Dave Grohl's band before he joined Nirvana, and had just finished it, hadn't yet edited it, and got a call from Randy Skinner at Warner Brothers asking me if I wanted to direct the video Find the River for REM. And I was, astonished and couldn't believe it, but of course said yes. And what I had found out was that River Phoenix was supposed to direct that video. It had become very popular in Europe, and REM needed a video for it, and he had suddenly passed away.
Wow.
Just like the week before. And REM was looking for like a young director to do it. And my friend Jefferson Holt, he later told me he'd put together a list of possible directors and given that list to Michael. And Michael obviously had remembered me from my documentation of these outsider artists and just picked me to do the video. And so I made it. I had to make it from concept to online in 8 days, which was a lot back then.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Do you remember what that process was like when you were making it?
Well, yeah, it was very fast. I had to do it crazy fast, because we were shooting film back then, and so you had to process the film and do the telecine. And I just cast it really fast. They had some live footage that this director, Gavin Newsom, had shot in the studio. So they already had some live, like natural kind of looking footage of the band performing, and they just wanted me to add some imagery to the music, to the band's performance. And so I put in, I had the video star this self-taught artist named Henry Hill, who Michael Stipe was a really big fan of and who had lived in Los Angeles, and my friend Roger Manley, who is a mutual friend of Michael's and mine, this incredible curator and photographer who was a mentor of mine, he'd turned us on to. So we had Henry Hill starring in that video, and we just shot it out in Malibu at a friend's house of mine that had just burned down in a fire out there.
So it's interesting to note the differences between making a music video then and now, to me. First of all, sidebar, I just recently watched My Own Private Idaho recently, and that River Phoenix's performance in that is like the best performance on screen I think I've ever seen. He's unbelievable.
Me too.
I just wanted to mention
love him in that movie.
Just so magnetic on camera, incredible. And actually, Keanu Reeves is very good in it too. But the second thing is, you mentioned somebody at Warner Brothers who says, I have all this money to make a music video. And a band like REM, who are huge, who say, we care about music videos. We want that money to go to a first-time filmmaker. Those are things that don't really happen like that anymore.
Oh, yeah. No, REM was a very unique and special band back then. And Jefferson actually had a lot to do with their activism and the, where they would have nonprofit groups outside their concerts and really encourage their fans to get involved in work like that. I mean, they were all interested in that. But I was very, very lucky. I mean, I really lucked into, all of this with Jefferson's support and then Michael believing in me and having me do it. But it was a very different world back then, directing music videos. Music videos were more expensive to make because people were shooting film. There weren't as many people who could make music videos. It was a little bit of a rarefied place, but at the same time, there was a lot of money rolling into the music industry at that time. So, after Nirvana got hugely successful, the music industry signed a ton of bands. There was just this huge deluge of newly signed indie bands and baby bands. And so even these bands that were just like barely formed, you know what I mean? Like someone's dad was an attorney at Warner Brothers or something, and they'd played a couple demos in a garage somewhere. Like so many bands got signed that weren't even quite ready, that there was just a lot of, videos being made.
And they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a Dinosaur Jr. video. Like, it was just a way that people used to do things. It's really kind of crazy when you step back and look at it. Once you start to turn away from music video stuff and you get into publishing and start to do other kinds of things, what were the steps that took you to the next phase of your career after doing like videos as a young person?
Yeah. Well, I was always interested in visionary artists, self-taught artists, radical spirituality, cults, things like that. I grew up in like a very loving but very Christian family, middle class, Midwestern family, in a very sheltered kind of environment. And I was always attracted to things that were sort of other, And so I'd been involved in that before I came out west to direct, music videos in college. My senior thesis was on this like apocalyptic self-taught artist, W.C. Rice, like an experimental documentary. And I was probably about like 26, 27, where I just realized that I was making this good living, as a music video director and a rock photographer. But I felt like a lot of it was spent time with, working with these kinds of bands, even though I worked with some amazing bands too. And I started to feel like kind of like an ad man, for the record industry. Right. And it was bumming me out,
When a band doesn't have a formed identity yet,
yeah,
it's being created as it's happening, which is not always the most authentic way to do things.
Well, and I could feel that. And then meanwhile, I was spending, my Sundays and holidays with this apocalyptic church, which was so highly original. And the people there were having these really deep experiences. And they were people, like my friends were kind of freaked out. They thought I was joining a cult. And even though they had first come for like the ironic, pleasure of it and then got concerned. But there was like there was a lot going on there that was making me just sort of reassess my life in the music video industry. And all of a sudden, the record industry in that world to me just began seeming less interesting, less compelling.
So you have like this interest in rock and roll, and then you also have this interest in kind of culty things. Well, church-based group. What you probably at the time were not calling a cult, but maybe in retrospect you might be able to view it that way.
I'll call it alternative spirituality, radical spirituality.
But rock and roll has always had a fascination with those things too. Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stones, Spinal Tap, Polyphonic Spree,
David Bowie.
There's always been an interest in that kind of stuff in music. Do you feel like that also informed why you were interested in it as well? Were those things that appealed to you as a kid?
That's such an interesting question. I never thought about that. Maybe on a subconscious level, Black Sabbath, Even though now I look at Black Sabbath and I have to laugh because they're sort of a fake occult band, even though I love them.
Oh, and Led Zeppelin, I mean, it's The Hobbit. Like,
well, I love that too.
Yeah.
Like, I love that it was like The Hobbit mixed with Crowley, and I love that Jimmy Page was actually really into Crowley. Like, he was a committed occultist, unlike, Ozzy Osbourne. I can't speak for Ozzy Osbourne, but, just the sort of like dualistic sort of like Judeo-Christian idea of Satanism versus like the occult path is a very different thing.
And like not forgetting that like Alice Cooper loves to play golf. I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like there's those kind of guys used it for a very specific purpose to kind of, appeal to teenage boys.
Yeah, and everybody's different. I mean, I can't, who knows? I can't speak for anybody. I mean, most occultists I know never say they're occultists or have videos with symbology in it. And then, they're more private about it.
Right. Anybody who was really, you'd like to think that anybody who was really into that lifestyle would not be advertising it, as like the front of their band or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, my favorite kind of occultists and occult videos are the ones where I really believe it, where the musician feels like they're embodying something that is authentic to who they are, and you can feel it like on a deeper level. You can feel that David Bowie was tapping into places that most people never touch. And it just feels different.
Are there favorite images of yours, like favorite videos, favorite things like that do come to mind?
I do love Arthur Brown's Fire. Do you know that video? I doubt that ever played on MTV, but it feels like it should have, And so I love his video. I love Sun Ra's music, and I love Space is the Place. That film is full of so much occult imagery, hermetic and extraterrestrial, stuff. I love all the Led Zeppelin stuff too, because they're great. And also, someone I consider a proto music video director. He was doing music videos on his own, but way before anybody was getting paid, was Kenneth Anger, the man who inspired thousands of music video directors, thousands of bands and filmmakers. I feel like he's sort of like the great grandfather of music video. And it's interesting that the great grandfather who influenced so many filmmakers and people was an occultist. And in the 90s, I barely even really understood what that meant. I was very attracted to the imagery, but, I didn't have my own practice at that point. Like, I was very materialist as well. And so his stuff. And
if I could stop you for 1 second, I'm interested. You mentioned Sun Ra, somebody who I love too.
Yeah.
I lived in Philadelphia for a long time. It's like an important figure there. Do you feel like there was an influence from like that kind of black spirituality onto like the occult stuff of the 70s that you became very interested in? Because I think about people like Eddie Gale, a lot of these free jazz guys, they kind of had these sort of like, they all wore robes on stage and there was like a cultish element. Obviously Sun Ra orchestras like that as well too.
That's an interesting question. Then there's Funkadelic, George Clinton. I feel like it was in the air back then. I mean, I feel like that was maybe an expression of alternative African-American spirituality that has a lot of Egypt in it, because Egypt is sort of like, the birthplace of the occult on this planet, apparently. And so there was that revival with like, African Americans reclaiming their ancient heritage through Egypt. So I think that had a lot to do with it. It was that period back in the 60s and 70s where a lot of artists and musicians were getting back to their roots. And part of getting back to one's roots involves a mystical concept of spirituality. I mean, this is what a lot of scholars, that I've read write about, Robert Elwood or Timothy Miller, is that, they consider that period, it was like a shifting of eras back then, sort of shifting from modernism into postmodernism. It's very similar to where we're at right now, with so much unrest, social unrest, polarization, this sort of culture war that's happening right now, this disparity between the rich and the poor. It's very 1967.
It seems like one of the major differences between somebody in a band and somebody in a cult is the way that is the language that they use. somebody might say my bandmate, but I noticed just even watching, Source Family or something like that, you hear words like father and brother and sister, and it changes. I'm kind of wondering what you see as like the major differences between allegiances to things like bands or artists or groups and cult leaders.
Well, bands usually aren't as psychic as cult leaders.
Aren't as psychic?
They don't have the same psychic powers as like a really good cult leader, although some do. David Bowie, Jimi Hendrix.
Mick Jagger.
What?
Oh, okay.
No, I think Mick is more like he was like an economics student. You know what I mean? He was like, I feel like he was guided. He's shamanic. He's shamanic for sure, but I don't know if I'd say he was clairvoyant. I don't know him personally though, so it's hard to say.
Yeah.
But I do want to say, just to answer your earlier question, I started getting a little bit more jaded by the music industry after, working with the Universal World Church, and that was what led me to start my first publishing company. Because I just decided that I would not be 30 years old and still be an ad person for the record industry. Yeah, and so that led me to do that. But I would say like bands versus cults. I mean, bands are certainly very culty, as we all know. And the Source Family's band, Yahweh 13, was very much like a lot of bands, a lot of infighting. Like even when they got back together, it's like a lot of creative minds together. But I think with a lot of radical spiritual groups, the emphasis is more on establishing a community. And so, with groups back then, there were a lot of families that formed. You had a lot of kids coming from parents who they didn't relate to. There was this huge generation gap, or people who had broken parents, broken fathers who had maybe been in World War II, totally ruined by the war, alcoholic, pill-popping mothers. A lot of the Source Family kids came from families like that, or from just like wealthy, narcissistic parents who didn't know how to love them or even love themselves, And so the Source Family was one of those groups that decided to reconstruct, not only create a new religion, but reconstruct the idea of family and what that means.
Music videos are sort of a tool of the cult world. It's been used that way before. There are music videos that cults have made.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are a number of alternative spiritual groups from that period who made their own films, and I mean, I haven't. There may be like music videos that are specifically music videos for these groups that I'm not aware of. Usually, they're integrated into larger films, or, in the Source Family's case, when they were in Hawaii, they did a number of live performances on public access television. Public access television is like, to me, it's the ultimate like music video channel from like the 80s and 90s, because you can see people making music videos or films that have music soundtracks prominent that are sometimes so imaginative and wild. And that's where Unarius was showing all of their films back in the 80s and 90s. So with the Source Family, I found, combing through all of their film archive, that they had a number of Super 8 films, first of all of them performing live at local high schools, which was totally mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It's like all of those producers, the principals back then were probably like all dropping acid and like going to swingers parties.
Like what administrator okayed that?
It's so crazy. But, they also had these videos that are really extraordinary of them performing in full like Egyptian costume on Hawaiian public access television. But they're really extraordinary, and they just have a power to them that you just don't find, in most other videos. There's just like this essence that I think comes from being a group of musicians who were occultists first and musicians second. Like their music was a result of their practice. Like their practice was not a result of their music. Their symbology was not a result of them having to make a music video. Their symbology was like deeply embedded in who they were.
And what is that symbology? Like, what are the recurring themes? What are the things that you see a lot?
Well, with the Source Family, they use the sign of Mercury a lot. Father Yod was really, really into that symbol and the idea of love and wisdom as a teaching combined. The women had like ankhs. They had custom symbols that they made just for the family. So Sunflower, who was the bass player in the band, actually custom made all of their jewelry. There were a number of symbols for them. With a group like Unarius, who first of all made a lot of their own instruments, played a lot of really incredible synthesizer music, in their films. Their symbology kind of goes back to occult symbology, but it really involves more to do. It's not so occulty. It's more like Space Brother type stuff. So for them, it's less symbols and more of like a palette of like, like bright colors and sparkly metallics and things like that, which make you feel like you're moving into some other dimension, And then there are, other groups from the 60s and 70s that were just using the classic, a lot of like Hermetic, Egyptian, Western magic symbols. It's interesting. I mean, for people who are occultists or who understand what those symbols are, it takes on a different meaning, but then you also see people using it in music videos, occultists are interested in, I can't speak for all occultists, but, to my understanding of like Western occultism, for example, is it's one of self-knowledge and transformation.
Jodi, Willie, thank you so much for joining me on Videohead.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, thank you. That was my chat with Jodi Willie. Jodi programs Occult LA, which you can find at the independent movie theater Cine Family in Los Angeles.